A black maid bowed to the most dangerous man in New York, and the whisper that followed stopped the entire banquet dead. The crystal chandeliers in the Waldorf ballroom might as well have been made of ice. Park Dongman, the legendary patriarch of the Busan syndicate, didn't just stop. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. All because of her. All because of Naomi. The woman everyone in the room had treated like furniture, overlooked, ignored, invisible. Until she lowered her head and whispered a proverb from the Busan docks in a dialect so raw, so guttural, and so authentic, it brought the scent of the Korean Sea into a room full of Manhattan's elite. The guests saw a humble servant in a pressed uniform. They were wrong. This ballroom wasn't a party. It was a cage filled with wolves in designer suits. These men didn't run a shipping empire on handshakes. They ran it on fear, silence, and the blood of those who dared to cross them. And now, Old Man Park had arrived from the shadows of Korea to test his son's strength, bringing a legacy of violence that spanned decades. But Naomi Carter understood legacy. At 27, she was a master of the art of being nothing, too foreign for the streets of Queens, yet carrying a Busan soul that the men in this room wouldn't recognize if it hit them. For 10 years, she had lived as a ghost, scrubbing floors and pouring wine for the very men who destroyed her world. They thought she was just another face in a service uniform. They didn't realize she was the only one in the room who knew exactly how their empire was going to fall. To the world, Naomi Carter was a master of the mundane. She was the rhythmic swish of a mop against marble at 4:00 a.m., the silent hands that replaced high thread count sheets, and the bowed head that accepted verbal abuse from entitled guests without a flicker of resentment. In the ecosystem of the elite, she was the background noise, present, necessary, and entirely ignored. But for Naomi, this invisibility was not a burden. It was a high-level tactical advantage. Every floor she scrubbed was a perimeter check. Every room she cleaned was a source of data. For 10 years, she had lived a life of dualities. By day, she was the reliable, soft-spoken maid at the estate, a woman whose name most of the staff couldn't remember. By night, in her cramped apartment in Queens, she was a cartographer of the criminal underworld. Her walls weren't decorated with photos of friends or family, but with flowcharts of shipping routes, grainy photographs of dockworkers, and the financial records of shell companies. She had learned to read the city not through its skyline, but through its trash and its whispers. She knew which businessmen left behind burner phones in their suites and which councilmen took their envelopes in the service elevators. She had cataloged the arrival of every high-ranking member of the Park Syndicate, noting the subtle shifts in their security details and the nervous tics of their lieutenants. While she polished the silver, she listened to the echoes in the hallways, conversations about logistics that were actually about human lives, and investments that were actually bribes meant to pave the way for Han Jin-woo's expansion. Her foster father, Park Sang-min, had taught her that the most dangerous person in the room is the one no one bothers to watch. He had raised her to be a ghost of the harbor, a weapon forged in the salt and steel of Busan. After his murder, that training had become her only inheritance. She didn't just work, she watched. She didn't just serve, she waited. Every "yes, sir," and "excuse me, ma'am" was a layer of armor, a disguise so perfect that it had become her skin. She was a ghost with a memory like a steel trap, collecting the sins of the powerful and tucking them away like stolen jewelry. She had become the silent witness to a decade of corruption, moving through the halls of power like smoke. The world saw a woman who had been defeated by circumstances, a maid who had reached the ceiling of her potential. They didn't realize that from the shadows of her nothingness, Naomi Carter was building a cage, and very soon she was going to shut the door. The arrival of Park Dongman was not a mere check-in. It was a military occupation disguised as hospitality. 3 black SUVs, their engines humming like a low-frequency warning, pulled into the Waldorf's private bay, and the very air in the lobby seemed to freeze in anticipation. This was the Dragon of Busan, a man whose influence was felt in the price of every shipping container that crossed the Pacific. Before the first door even opened, Mr. Henderson, the hotel's lead manager, had gathered the staff in a windowless basement corridor for what he called a briefing, but what Naomi recognized as a masterclass in institutionalized fear. Henderson, a man who usually prided himself on his unflappable New York cynicism, was sweating through his silk tie. He paced before the line of housekeepers and servers, his voice low and vibrating with a frantic edge. "You are not people today," Henderson hissed, his eyes darting toward the security monitors. "You are ghosts. You are automated shadows. The Park family does not want to see your personality, they do not want to hear your breathing, and they certainly do not want your eye contact. If you so much as drop a teaspoon, consider your career in this city finished. This isn't about luxury, it's about survival. Do you understand?" Naomi stood at the end of the line, her hands clasped loosely at her waist, her expression a mask of perfect, vacant compliance. While Henderson ranted about the sanctity of the VIP experience, Naomi was busy memorizing the tactical layout of the security detail she saw on the screens. She watched as Young-ho Park stepped out first, his sharp, predatory eyes scanning the roof lines before he held the door for his father. When Park Dongman finally emerged, he looked smaller than the legend suggested, yet he moved with a gravity that drew every eye toward him. He walked with a slight limp, a souvenir from the Harbor Wars Naomi remembered all too well, and his gaze was like a cold wind from the East Sea. As the entourage moved toward the private elevators, the tension in the hotel staff was palpable, a collective holding of breath that made the lungs ache. Henderson's final warning rang in Naomi's ears as she was assigned to the 42nd floor VIP pantry. "One mistake, and you're gone." Naomi lowered her head, the ghost of a bitter smile touching her lips as she adjusted her apron. Henderson thought the danger was a spilled drink or a loud footfall. He didn't realize that the real danger had already arrived 10 years ago, and she was currently wearing a name tag that said Naomi. The dragon had landed, but he didn't realize he was walking into a lair she had been decorating for a decade. The malfunction of Service Elevator 4 was the variable Naomi hadn't planned for. But it was the one fate demanded. Forced to use the guest lift to deliver the vintage 1982 Bordeaux requested for the penthouse, she stepped out into the 42nd floor corridor just as the heavy oak doors of the banquet suite swung open. The hallway was a gauntlet of black suits and coiled aggression. At the center of the phalanx walked Park Dongman, his expression a mask of weary iron, flanked by a son who looked ready to dismantle the world. The collision was minor, a mere brush of shoulders as the entourage swept past, but in the sterile, high-tension silence of the hallway, it felt like a tectonic shift. Naomi's tray tilted dangerously. Her reflexes, honed by years of Busan Street drills, kicked in before her mind could intervene. She steadied the bottle with a grace that was entirely too fluid for a common servant, dropping into a deep, reflexive bow of apology. The patriarch stopped. It was a subtle movement, but the entire security detail halted with him, their hands drifting toward their waistbands. Dongman looked down at the top of Naomi's head, his eyes cold and dismissive, ready to walk over her like a crack in the sidewalk. Then, Naomi felt the ghost of her foster father at her shoulder. She knew that if she let this moment pass, she would remain a ghost forever. In a voice that was barely more than a breath, yet resonant enough to vibrate in the marrow of Dongman's bones, she spoke the proverb of the Jagalchi fishmongers, a phrase used only by those who had bled on the Busan piers. "The tide only hides the rocks, it never removes them," she whispered in the thick, rhythmic satori of a harbor native. The effect was instantaneous. Park Dongman didn't just freeze, he recoiled as if struck. The controlled shock in his eyes was a crack in a dam that had held for 50 years. He leaned forward, his shadow engulfing her, his intense gaze searching her face with a desperate, calculating hunger. Behind him, Yang-ho's face transformed into a mask of lethal suspicion, his body leaning over her with a predatory weight. For a heartbeat, the invisible Maid was the only person in the universe to the most feared man in Korea. The air in the corridor grew suffocatingly thin. Dongman's hand, gnarled and powerful, reached out as if to touch her shoulder, his fingers trembling with the recognition of a dialect that shouldn't exist in a Manhattan hallway. He wasn't looking at a maid anymore. He was looking at a living, breathing piece of a home he thought had been swallowed by the sea. The banquet. Behind them was forgotten. The power had shifted. The maid had spoken, and the dragon was finally, terrifyingly, awake. The tension that had paralyzed the corridor didn't break. It shattered. Just as Park Dongman reached out toward Naomi, the heavy silence of the floor was obliterated by the muffled thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire. A decorative floor vase near the patriarch's head disintegrated into a cloud of porcelain dust. The security detail, momentarily distracted by Naomi's presence, scrambled to react, but the ambush was surgical. 2 of the outer rim bodyguards fell before they could even draw their weapons. In the chaos, the humble maid vanished. Naomi didn't scream and she didn't cower. As a third round whistled through the air, she lunged forward, her silver tray becoming a flashing disc of steel that deflected a stray fragment before she slammed her shoulder into Park Dongman's chest. The impact was calculated, sending the elderly man sprawling into the recessed safety of a service alcove just as a hail of bullets chewed through the marble where he had been standing. Yang Ho spun, his pistol clearing his holster, but he was blind to the shooter's position behind the heavy velvet drapes. Naomi wasn't. She had spent a decade studying the acoustics and blind spots of this very hallway. Without a word, she snatched a heavy, decorative brass stanchion from its velvet rope. With a fluid, athletic rotation that spoke of years of hidden drills, she hurled the metal bar. It tore through the curtains, followed by a grunt of pain and the clatter of a dropped rifle. 3 o'clock behind the pillar, 2 more in the stairwell, Naomi barked, her voice no longer a whisper but a commanding snap that cut through the panic. Yang Ho hesitated for a fraction of a second, stunned by the authority in her tone, before he adjusted his fire and neutralized the threat behind the pillar. Naomi didn't wait for him to catch up. She grabbed the patriarch by his lapels, hoisting him to his feet with a strength that defied her slender frame. She shielded his body with her own, using the geometry of the hallway to keep him in the dead zone of the remaining shooters. The attackers, dressed in the nondescript maintenance uniforms of the hotel, began to move in, but they were no longer facing a panicked staff and a confused security team. They were facing a woman who knew every inch of this battlefield. Naomi kicked a service trolley into the path of the advancing men, creating a temporary barricade, then turned to the stunned patriarch. "If you want to live to see Busan again, you move when I move," she said, her eyes burning with a lethal, focused light. The submissive mask was gone, replaced by the cold, tactical iron of a survivor. The maid had become the shield, and the banquet hall was now a slaughterhouse where only the invisible had the power to see. The escape was a blur of screeching tires and secondary service exits, but the silence that followed in the cramped elevator of a queen's walk-up was even louder. Yang Ho kept his hand on his weapon, his eyes darting between the peeling wallpaper and the woman who had just saved his father's life. When Naomi pushed open the door to her apartment, the air didn't smell like the Waldorf's expensive lilies. It smelled of old paper, cold coffee, and the sharp ozone of electronic equipment. As she flipped the light switch, the Park family froze for the second time that night. This wasn't a home, it was a war room. Every inch of the studio apartment's walls was covered in a sprawling, obsessive web of intelligence. Blueprints of the Busan docks were pinned next to high-resolution surveillance photos of Manhattan piers. Red string interconnected the faces of low-level street soldiers to the high-ranking board members of the Park Syndicate, all of them eventually leading to a single, circled name in the center: Han Jin-woo. Map overlays of the city's sewer systems and private fiber-optic lines sat atop stacks of translated financial ledgers that should have been impossible for a civilian to possess. "You've been hunting him," Park Dongman whispered, his voice trembling as he walked toward a section of the wall dedicated to his own family's history. He reached out to touch a faded photograph of Naomi's foster father, Park Sang-min. Next to it was a meticulously detailed timeline of the night the fire had claimed Sang-min's life, and the list of every man who had held a torch that night. Naomi didn't offer them a seat. She walked to a desk where 3 monitors hummed, their screens scrolling through real-time feeds of the hotel's security cameras and intercepted police frequencies. "I didn't just hunt him," she said. Her voice regained its steady, rhythmic Busan lilt. "I mapped him. I know where he sleeps, where he hides his ledgers, and which of your lieutenants are currently on his payroll." She turned to face the patriarch and his son, the glow of the monitors casting sharp blue shadows across her face. "For 10 years, you thought you were the only ones looking for justice, but while you were building empires, I was building a cage. You see a maid's apartment. I see the place where Han Jin-woo's world ends." Yang Ho stepped forward, looking at a map that highlighted the syndicate's secret American distribution hubs, locations even he didn't know were compromised. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The woman they had ignored for a decade hadn't just been surviving. She had been the most effective intelligence operative in the hemisphere, operating right under their noses. The invisible girl had become the only person with the power to show the dragon where its own heart was being cut out. The flickering blue light of the monitors played across Naomi's face as she tapped a key, pulling up a series of encrypted ledger entries. Yang Ho leaned in, his jaw tight, as he scanned the rows of numbers that represented his family's lifeblood. To the untrained eye, it was a standard overseas diversification strategy. To Naomi, it was a confession. "Your father's empire is hemorrhaging," Naomi said, her voice dropping into that low, rhythmic Busan cadence that commanded attention. She pointed to a series of offshore accounts linked to the syndicate's logistics wing. "Every time a container leaves the port of Busan for your New Jersey terminal, 5% of the manifest value vanishes into a ghost company called Blue Harbor Holdings." Yang Ho's eyes widened. "That's Choi's department. My father has trusted Choi for 30 years. He was at my wedding. He was at my mother's funeral." "Then he's been lying to you for at least 10 of those years," Naomi countered, her fingers flying across the keyboard to reveal a secondary layer of data. She pulled up a grainy, long-lens photograph taken outside a nondescript warehouse in Staten Island. In the frame, a man in a sharp gray suit, the syndicate's CFO, Mr. Choi, was handing a briefcase to a shadowed figure with a distinctive, jagged scar across his knuckles. Park Dongman made a sound like a wounded animal. "Han Jin-woo." "Choi isn't just skimming," Naomi explained, her tone clinical yet heavy with the weight of the betrayal. "He's been laundering the Park family's legitimate shipping profits to fund Jin-woo's expansion into human trafficking. He's been using your own ships, your own routes, and your own legal protections to build the machine that is currently trying to kill you. The hit at the hotel tonight, that wasn't just an external attack. It was a coordinated strike funded by your own treasury." The room went cold. The betrayal wasn't just a financial leak. It was a rot at the very foundation of the Park legacy. For 10 years, Naomi had watched this cancer grow from the service corridors and the shadows of the docks, documenting every transaction while the Parks remained blinded by a misplaced sense of loyalty. "Choi thinks I'm a ghost," Naomi said, turning to look at the patriarch. "He thinks the women he moves through those ports are nameless. He forgot that a ghost sees everything." Yang Ho straightened, his hand gripping the back of Naomi's chair until his knuckles turned white. The realization that their most trusted advisor was the architect of their downfall changed the geometry of the war. They weren't just fighting a rival, they were fighting a shadow within their own house. And the only person who knew how to navigate that darkness was the woman the world had deemed invisible. Naomi didn't ask for permission to lead. She simply began to move, and the two most powerful men in the syndicate found themselves following her rhythm. "Choi and Jin-woo expect you to hide," she said, her hands moving across a secondary terminal. "They expect a frantic, bloody retaliation that they can predict and counter. They aren't prepared for a ghost to haunt their bank accounts." In the pre-dawn shadows, Naomi didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, she reached for the tools of her decade-long masquerade. A generic janitorial badge, a master keycard she'd cloned months ago, and a collection of micro-trackers no larger than a grain of rice. She moved back into the world of service, but this time, her invisibility was an active blade. While the Parks coordinated their loyalists from the safety of the Queen's apartment, Naomi returned to the hotel, not as a victim of the ambush, but as the silent cleanup crew. The attackers had left behind a mess, but they had also left behind a digital trail. Dressed in a fresh, nondescript maintenance jumpsuit, Naomi slipped past the police tape and the distracted security guards. To them, she was just another worker sent to scrub the blood from the marble, a person so common they didn't even bother to check her ID twice. She moved through the executive offices with a predator's grace, planting the micro-trackers inside the hardware of the syndicate's own secure servers. With a few keystrokes from a hidden tablet, she bypassed Choi's biometric locks using the administrative bypass codes she'd harvested while dusting his desk weeks prior. She wasn't just watching anymore. She began to systematically freeze the Blue Harbor Holdings accounts, rerouting the funds into a series of dead-end escrow accounts that would take months to untangle. On the screens of Jin Woo's hidden terminals across the city, digital assets began to vanish like mist. She watched through the hotel's internal cameras as Choi paced his office, his face turning a sickly gray as his phone buzzed with alerts of access denied. He looked right at the camera, right at Naomi's digital lens, but he saw nothing but an empty hallway. He didn't realize that the woman who had spent years emptying his trash had just emptied his life's work. "The cage is locked," Naomi whispered into her comms, her voice a cold, sharp echo in the empty service corridor. She had crippled the giant not with a bullet, but with the very thing he had used to build his empire, his own arrogance. He had ignored her for 10 years, and in that decade, she had learned exactly how to turn off his world. The counterattack had begun, and the man who thought he was a king was about to find out what it felt like to be truly, utterly powerless. The warehouse district of Long Island City was a graveyard of industrial ghosts, but the private club at its heart hummed with the electric arrogance of a man who thought he had won. Jin Woo sat behind a mahogany desk, his scarred knuckles tapping a rhythmic beat of victory as he waited for the confirmation of the Park patriarch's death. He didn't notice the server entering the room. She was wearing the same charcoal vest and white button-down as the rest of the catering staff, her movements efficient, her head respectfully bowed. She placed a crystal glass of whiskey on his desk, the ice clinking with a sound like shattering glass. Jin Woo didn't look up. "About time," he muttered. "Tell Choi to get in here. We have a transition to manage." "Mr. Choi is currently unavailable," Naomi said. Her voice wasn't the soft, hollow tone of a servant. It was the cold, rhythmic steel of the Busan docks. Jin Woo's hand froze. He looked up, his predatory eyes narrowing at the woman standing before him. He saw the dark skin and the service uniform, but he felt a presence that made the air in the room turn to ice. "Who the hell are you?" Naomi didn't flinch. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, sleek tablet, sliding it across the polished wood. "I'm the person who just turned off your lights." As Jin Woo stared at the screen, his face drained of color. In real time, he watched his encrypted bank accounts, the ones holding the blood money from a decade of trafficking, hit zero. His hidden shipping manifests were being broadcast to every federal agency on the coast. The invisible woman stood over him, her gaze as sharp as a garrote. "You don't remember me, but I remember the fire," Naomi whispered, the Busan satori thick and menacing. "You thought you killed every witness in Sang Min's house. You thought a girl like me didn't count as a person, let alone a threat." Jin Woo lunged for the drawer where he kept his weapon, but Naomi was faster. She didn't use a gun. She used the heavy glass bottle from her tray, slamming it into his wrist with the precision of a trained assassin. As he howled in pain, the monitors behind him began to flicker with the logo of the Park Syndicate. "The Parks are coming for what's left of your soul," she said, leaning in until she was inches from his face. "But the law is coming for your empire. I've spent 10 years serving men like you, Jin Woo. I've learned exactly how to take out the trash." She stood up, smoothing her apron with a terrifying calm. Outside, the distant wail of sirens began to tear through the night. Jin Woo, the butcher of Busan, looked up at the maid he had never bothered to notice, and for the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to be the one who was truly, utterly nothing. Naomi turned and walked out, leaving the king of the underworld to drown in the digital ruins of his own making. The sirens faded into the distance, leaving the queen's apartment in a rare, heavy stillness. The blue light of the monitors had been replaced by the soft, amber glow of a rising sun bleeding through the window blinds. Park Dongman sat at Naomi's scarred wooden desk, no longer looking like a fugitive, but like a man who had finally found a compass in a storm. He looked at the walls, the decade of meticulous intelligence, the maps of a world he thought he owned but never truly understood, and then he looked at Naomi. She was standing by the window, the service vest discarded, her sleeves rolled up to reveal the lean muscle of a woman who had spent 10 years preparing for a war. For the first time since she was a child in Busan, the weight of the invisible mask was gone. "You saved the foundation of my family," Dongman said, his voice thick with a respect that surpassed mere gratitude. "But you did something more. You saw the rot we were too proud to notice. My son and I, we have built a kingdom on blood and silence. It is a fragile thing, easily broken by men like Jin Woo." Yang Ho stepped forward, his expression uncharacteristically humble. He held out a folder, not a file on an enemy, but a proposal for a restructured park syndicate. "My father is returning to Busan to oversee the transition there. I will remain here, but the old ways are dead. We need someone who can navigate the shadows without being consumed by them. We need an architect." Naomi turned from the window. She didn't see the black maid in the glass anymore, nor did she see the ghost of Busan. She saw a woman who had bridged two worlds with nothing but her own iron will. "You're asking me to join the family," she said, her Busan satori now carrying a note of executive authority. "I am asking you to lead it," Dongmin corrected. "Not as a soldier, but as the strategist who ensures we never lose our way again. The dragon's architect." Naomi looked at the folder, then at the two men. For 10 years, her only goal had been a destructive justice. Now a different path stretched out before her, a chance to transform the very machine that had once nearly crushed her. She wasn't just a survivor anymore, she was a creator. "I won't be a shadow in your halls," Naomi said, her voice steady and resonant. "And I won't be invisible. If I build this, we do it in the light." Yang Ho nodded, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. "In the light, Naomi." As the sun finally climbed over the queen's skyline, Naomi Carter took her seat at the table. The maid was gone and the ghost had found its voice. She had spent a lifetime being underestimated, but as she looked at the map of her new empire, she knew one thing for certain: no one would ever look through her again.